There are a number of core principles which I've taken into account when producing the report. First, as I've said, I have no power to and have not made findings of civil or criminal liability. Rather, my task has been to get to the truth of what happened on the 23rd and 24th of November 2021, and to make such recommendations as seem appropriate in the light of the inquiry's investigative work and my conclusions about the facts. Secondly, under the inquiry's inquisitorial process, there was no burden of proof and no fixed standards by reference to which findings of fact were to be made. I adopted a flexible approach with conclusions in terms of the likelihood that an event did or did not occur. In many cases, the evidence is clear and there can be no dispute that a certain event did occur. In other cases, my conclusion is that it's more likely than not that an event occurred, or alternatively, that it's possible that an event occurred. In a few cases, uncertainty remains, but in my view, this has no bearing on the central issues for the inquiry. Finally, in making conclusions, I've been mindful of the dangers of using hindsight when considering the actions of those involved in the events of the night. Although I've identified failings by people on the night, I've considered each of these in the context of what was known at the time, the resources available, the preparations made, and the procedures then in place. Overall, my conclusion is that the underlying causes were systemic in nature, even where failings are attributable or potentially attributable to individuals. An analysis of these in their full context provides the basis for the recommendations in the report. The report is over 450 pages long. Before giving a brief summary of the conclusions and recommendations, I should first say that in order fully to understand and appreciate the findings, there's no substitute for reading the full text. However, we have provided a 15-page executive summary at the outset of the report. The important point to stress is that what follows in these remarks is by definition an extremely compressed and highly abbreviated version of the report itself, shorn of all the supporting detail and evidence, and without the detailed reasoning which underpins the conclusions. With that qualification, I turn to the first question in the terms of reference, namely, who were the individuals who lost their lives in the Channel on the 23rd to the 24th of November 2021? The inquiry has been able to determine with confidence the identities of 26 of the 27 people who lost their lives, and of 4 people who are believed to have been on the boat but whose bodies have not been found. While the identity of the 27th person whose body was found can't be conclusively ascertained, the inquiry has been able to suggest his identity. The report also identifies 2 survivors of the incident. One of them gave evidence at the full hearings. On this basis, there were at least 33 people, men, women and children, in the small boat, which set out from France on that evening of the 23rd of November 2021. The inquiry can't be certain that there were no other people on board, including children, whose families may never know their fate. Most of the report, in fact all of it except for the first and final 2 chapters, is devoted to the remaining key questions in the terms of reference, namely when, where, and in what circumstances did the deceased come by their deaths. By way of introduction to the conclusions in relation to these questions, I think it's helpful to give the briefest outline of what happened that evening. We can begin when people smugglers dispatched an unseaworthy and overcrowded small boat from the French coast at about 9 in the evening of the 23rd of November 2021. It had on board, as I say, at least 33 people. They were in an overcrowded conditions. They had paid the people smugglers thousands of pounds for their place on the boat and had been assured of safe passage to the United Kingdom. Only 2 of those on board would survive the journey. We can't now be certain what caused the boat to fail. However, about 3 hours into the journey, the boat began to take on significant amounts of water and later became swamped. Those on board tried in vain to bail out the water and made panicked mobile telephone calls for help. One of them called a smuggler who had arranged the journey and sent him their location. He did nothing to help. Just after 1 a.m. on the 24th of November 2021, His Majesty's Coast Guard was notified by the French Coast Guard that there was a small boat around half a nautical mile from the middle of the channel, with 33 people on board. HM Coast Guard called this Instant Charlie. Shortly afterwards, the French authorities transferred a mobile call from a 16-year-old on board. He spoke to HM Coast Guard for about 20 minutes. He said they were, quote, in the water, unquote, and required immediate assistance. Geolocation information was then sent to HM Coast Guard, which showed the boat was in the Sandetti area of the channel, close to the median line, but on the UK side. More desperate calls were made and messages sent from the stricken small boat, though some calls and messages were missed. HM Coast Guard issued a mayday relay broadcast, but a nearby French naval vessel, the Flamand, did not respond. Meanwhile, at around 1:30 a.m., HM Coast Guard had tasked a border force cutter, the Valiant. The Valiant did not leave the port of Dover until 2:22 a.m. and took another hour to reach the last known location of Instant Charlie. Just before 3 a.m., HM Coast Guard also tasked a helicopter, R163, while the Valiant was en route. When the Valiant arrived in the Sandetti area at around 3:24 a.m., it was unable to locate the boat. The coordinates had been given to Border Force more than an hour and a half earlier, so that by the time the Valiant arrived, it seems very likely that the small boat had drifted away. Between 3:30 and 7:20 a.m., the helicopter and the Valiant located 3 small boats. The Valiant embarked 98 people in all. None of the boats found by the Valiant matched the description of Instant Charlie. Dawn came around 7 a.m. One of the 2 survivors told the Inquiry that when the sun rose over the water, there were some people still clinging to the remains of the small boat. The bodies of others were floating around them. He recalled a mother screaming as she searched for her children. By this time, the helicopter had been stood down and the Valiant was returning to Dover with its 98 people that it had embarked. No one in the UK was looking for the small boat and no one came to its rescue. At around 12:30 p.m. that day, the 24th of November 2021, a French fishing vessel sailing approximately 9 nautical miles off the coast of Calais found the first of the bodies floating in the water. HM Coast Guard were notified at around 1 p.m., nearly 12 hours after they had received the first calls for help. Ultimately, bodies of those who had been on the small boat were recovered to France, and 2 survivors were rescued. This, as I say, is the barest outline of what happened that night, but I hope it goes some way to explaining why the inquiry was established. In Part 3, Chapter 8 of the report, there is a minutely detailed narrative of the events of that night, which draws on the huge amount of documentary material and evidence which my team and I have considered during our investigation. In order to set that narrative account in its full and proper context, the preceding chapters of the report, chapters 2 to 7, address the relevant legal framework and the UK's legal obligations for search and rescue at sea. These chapters then set out the history of small boat crossings since they arose to prominence in 2018 and identified the challenges which small boats present for search and rescue. These chapters also describe the key UK and French organisations involved in responding to small boats before turning to the UK government's approach to the many challenges posed by the increasing number of small boat crossings over the years and the specific systems in place to meet them before November 2021. Following on from the detailed narrative of the night in Chapter 8, the report in Chapters 9 to 12 analyse what occurred by focusing on the resources that were available to the UK search and rescue services that night, before considering the initial response to Incident Charlie, and in particular, the information gathering about the nature of its distress. Subsequent chapters analyse the search response to the incident and the events which led to the erroneous conclusion that the small boat involved in Incident Charlie had been rescued. On the basis of this analysis, I stress again that the full details are set out in the report itself. Chapter 15 of the report concludes that some of the deaths which took place that night and during the following morning were avoidable. In very broad outline, the argument is as follows, the analysis is as follows. First, I accept the conclusion of the MABE in its report that, quote, by providing an unsuitable craft and inadequate safety equipment for the crossing, and by crowding 33 people onto the boat, the people who facilitated the attempted crossing put the occupants of the boat at high risk of coming to harm, end of quote. Secondly, the inquiry's expert on survivability concluded that those on board who survived cold water shock when entering the water would have eventually drowned when they could no longer hold onto the buoyant remains of the small boat. That was as a result either of physical incapacitation due to cooling of their hands, arms and legs, loss of consciousness, or of cardiac arrest due to hypothermia. Therefore, it's likely that the majority was still alive when the Border Force vessel Valiant arrived at the Mayday relay position at around 3:24 a.m. on the 24th of November 2021. I also accept that some of those on board the small boat were still alive at sunrise at about 9 a.m. that day, although they would have died between then and the time of rescue in the early afternoon that day.